As an ethnic studies major, I've read countless amounts of books and passages centered around race and the effects of racism. One that stuck with me was a New York Times article about a pregnant woman who in recent years passed as white to avoid her child being taken away from her in the hospital. Now, this deserves a little more context, as her fear stemmed from years of her own trauma being a light-skinned black woman. As a young girl, she was told she was too light and struggled to fit in with her black peers. She was even considered too light to be her obviously black mother's daughter, and during her own birth was even separated from her mother due to the fact the hospital swapped her out with a darker, more suitable baby for her mother. She also remembers the black people in her life being treated poorly and routinely being victims of racist acts. The discrimination was something she grew used to, but the trauma followed her deep into her adult life, especially when she became pregnant herself. When it came time to giving birth, her trauma got the best of her, and in deciding to not chance her own child being misplaced, like she was, she decided to pass, checking white on her hospital forms. This was a woman so unsure, insecure, and scared of how society would perceive her and her child that she decided to be something she wasn't. Her story stuck with me because it showed just how racism could greatly affect someone's psychology. We live in a society that's so dependent on classification, and race and color are unfortunately the most common ways to classify and judge someone. It was this article that immediately reminded me of the 2021 movie Passing. The film covers many of the same themes that the article does, but may better explain the origins of the passing phenomena through its haunting yet important portrayal of how some had to navigate through the segregation era. The film explores these themes in a more subtle way by using contrast through the story's setting, characters, and visual aesthetic. So without wasting any more time, let's jump right into how Passing explores racism through contrast. The contrast could immediately be seen in the fact that the story's two main characters are Irene and Claire, two black women who live in the white-dominated 1920s. The film really does a great job right from the beginning, showing us the stark contrasts between black and white Americans. For example, the film opens with us meeting Irene while she's out shopping on a hot summer day, and eventually she decides to go to the nicer, more white side of town. While out, she becomes growingly thirsty, and we see her hesitate before entering a presumably white-only hotel dining room to get something to drink. Right away, us, the audience, along with Irene, are expertly thrusted into an uncomfortable situation. But more importantly, without a word being spoken, we are transported into a time where black individuals actually had to think about and potentially risk their own safety when entering certain establishments. Obviously, this is in direct contrast to how most white people probably lived their lives, as they could virtually go anywhere with no limitations or consequences at all. While the setting and era set the tone early on, the film's true strength lies in the contrast we see between Irene and Claire respectively. Although these are two women who are similar in ethnicity, therefore subjected to the same racial discrimination, their philosophies for navigating around this discrimination couldn't be any more different. This takes us back to Irene. Shortly after we see her hesitate before entering the diner, we see her almost physically hiding behind her hat while she's inside, so as to avoid her true identity being realized. It is at this moment we realize she is caught, but not by a white individual. Instead, she's caught by Claire, who is also black, but she's sitting comfortably and confidently in the dining room. Still without much dialogue, We are given not just insight into the time and place that our characters are living in, but already insight into how Irene and Claire are contradictions of one another. So I think at this point, it's important to mention the fact Irene and Claire are passing. Passing is the concept of someone attempting to portray themselves and are often regarded to by others as being a part of a social group that they may not belong to. In this case, both Irene and Claire are fairly complected, light-skinned black women who in most circumstances could pass as being white. So if both could pass, why does Claire look more confident doing so than Irene? This will become more clear throughout the film. But finally, after a pretty uncomfortable stare down between the two, Claire makes her way over to Irene, and we get the first meaningful conversation of the film. In this conversation, we figure out Claire and Irene are old school friends, but more importantly, we learn that Claire has fully embraced the idea of passing as a white woman. So much so that she even got married to and started a family with a white man. Irene passively judges Claire, and Claire simply hits back at her, asking her what is she doing in the diner herself, seemingly calling out Irene's contradictory behavior. Nonetheless, Claire still wants to catch up, so they head up to her hotel room, despite Irene being reluctant to do so. Their trip down memory lane is cut short by Claire's white husband showing up, and bro is immediately racist. Now this angers Irene, and it's through all of this we realize that the two women share completely different views on passing. Claire fully takes on the persona of a white woman, and Irene seems to only do so out of convenience. Their different philosophies have allowed them to live two completely different or contrasting lives. For example, Irene lives in a predominantly black community in Harlem. She's married to a black man. And Claire lives in a wealthy Chicago neighborhood and is married to a white man. Irene is still very much in touch with her black roots, likely facing the same discrimination as those in her community, while Claire is fully accepted into white circles and reaps the benefits of luxury and equal treatment. And once Irene and Claire rekindle their friendship and begin hanging out together, we learn both women desire aspects of each other's lives. As Claire begins hanging out with Irene and her family, she realizes that she misses being around black people and black culture. She seemingly impresses those that she comes into contact with, and after a while, this slowly begins to bother Irene. Now, some who have analyzed the film would even say Irene is judgmental and pretty cold towards Claire. While I do agree, I think it's important to share that I think it's a little bit deeper than this. I think Irene sees Claire as a woman who wants to live a double life. Someone who wants to enjoy the positives of being black, such as the community and culture, but doesn't want any of the hardships that come with it. I understand Irene's frustration with this. Claire, in a sense, has abandoned her blackness, ignores her husband's abusive and racist rhetoric, and maybe possible actions towards her own people, all for a high-class lifestyle. And that's something I believe Irene ultimately cannot look past. Of course, I do think jealousy plays a factor. I do think Irene views Claire's life as easy and freeing, while hers and that of her husbands and kids remains covered by the ever-present shadow of discrimination, injustice, and violence. But where I think the film truly shines is in its ability to show us that although Irene and Claire navigate life differently in terms of how they proclaim their racial identity, they are both victims of the same thing, and that's living in a society where one feels the need to pass it all just to achieve a better life. I spent most of this movie examining the tension between Irene and Claire, and like many, trying to figure out which one of them is wrong. Is Irene wrong for judging Claire for doing what she needed to do in order to achieve a better life? Was Claire wrong for abandoning the identity of her ancestors and seemingly turning her back on her own people? Personally, I don't think either of them are wrong, and in my opinion, that's the whole point of the film and Nella Larson's novel of the same name. I think Passing is ultimately a story of the toll a racist and discriminatory society can have on one's identity. I also think there's elements of the idea centered around the tragic mulatto. This is a concept that usually applies to light-skinned, biracial black women who could basically pass. In a sense, black people at large struggle to fit into society amongst white people. But for lighter-skinned or biracial individuals, they may not even be accepted amongst their own. So what truly is their place in the world? Perhaps this is why famed sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois praised the novel, as it ties into another theory he helped popularize called the double consciousness theory. Now, this is the concept that claims black Americans often remain aware of how both white and black people perceive them in the world, therefore adding added pressure and affecting how they navigate daily life. I think we see both the concept of the tragic mulatto and double consciousness in the film, mainly through the character of Claire. She essentially has no true identity, and she is largely living her life trying to please and reap the rewards of both the white and the black world. Irene also struggles with these concepts as well, but in a more internalized and passive way. There is no denying the fact she's jealous of the luxuries Claire is afforded by successfully passing. And while she understandably resents Claire for putting up with and seemingly accepting the racists in her life, Irene herself doesn't do much to directly oppose racism either. In fact, we even see her get upset with her husband when he attempts to teach their children about the discrimination and injustices black people endure. This is because Claire, in her own right, struggles with her own identity and place in the world, resulting in her simply just choosing not to disrupt society's status quo. Irene refuses to believe her and Claire are two sides of the same coin, when in reality they are both marred by societal racism, and instead of realizing this, they ultimately view each other as opposites. In my opinion, Irene and Claire were just two people fighting the same enemy. They just happened to be blindfolded and ended up becoming enemies to one another. And this is one of the less talked about aspects of racism and those who have a history of being oppressed. It often leads to those fighting the same battle, resenting or even fighting one another. I believe this is why the film ends on such a tragic note with Claire's death. After her husband finds out her true identity, he tracks down Claire at a party Irene and her husband are throwing. He charges towards her as she makes her way towards the outside balcony next to Irene. Claire somehow ends up falling off of the balcony and ultimately succumbing to her injuries. The police simply write Claire's death off as an accident, and the film closes with Irene crying in her husband's arms. Now, we are deliberately left wondering what really happened. Did Claire's husband push her? Did Irene push her? Or was it truly an accident? Now, this is obviously left ambiguous, and I have seen countless amounts of theories with many believing Irene did push her. While this could make sense due to Irene's own suspicions and insecurities and maybe even hatred towards Claire, I don't think it's what actually went down at all. I don't think Irene or Claire's husband pushed Claire off the balcony, because someone at the party would have mentioned that to the police, or at the very least seen it and called either one of them out. I ultimately think Claire, realizing she had nowhere to go after this moment, decided to jump off on her own. I think Claire was a damaged individual, but one who severely got by based on the perception of what others thought of her. Up until this moment, she was seen as exotic and majestic and perfect, someone who could essentially get whatever she wanted in life. And with her secret now being known to the world, that life would no longer exist. So she thought in that moment, maybe it would be easier if she no longer existed either. I think Irene crying at the end, however, is from guilt, but not guilt that she murdered someone. Guilt that she was happy Claire, or in her eyes, the enemy, was finally gone. Or maybe it was guilt from realizing she could have done more to save Claire. We'll never really know. Regardless, the film's ending is open to interpretation, and truly one of those endings that has been and will continue to be talked about for a while. I ultimately think Passing is a story that can be viewed from many different perspectives. Some have claimed it's a story about sexual identity or even depression, and I am no one to say that those theories are wrong. I, however, tend to think it's a story that simply explores the effects of racism, more specifically, how racism has affected the identity of Black Americans, and how this loss of identity can have psychological effects, possibly even leading to a loss of self-worth and possibly even resentment, not just towards oneself, but others who look like them, often mistaking each other for the problem instead of the racist structures and ideologies that convinced them so. And the film explores this through the use of contrast. The contrast between the rules that govern Black and white life, through Irene and Claire, and even through the film being shot in the contrasting colors of black and white. Passing is one of those films that I feel didn't get anywhere near the recognition that it should have gotten. It's an excellent debut from director Rebecca Ferguson, as her ability to show restraint and take a more subtle approach to the topic fit the source material perfectly. Whenever a film can garner the same emotions its novel demands, it deserves respect. I also think it's a beautifully shot film, and Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga are completely magnetic. They are two of the best actresses working today, and this film shows exactly why. I do think the film is a bit slow at times, and maybe it's almost too beautifully adapted to the point it almost feels more like a poem. This at times can make it hard to fully transport into the world and feel all of the emotions we probably should be feeling. Nonetheless, I think it's a movie that works largely because of the story it's trying to tell, its gorgeous cinematography, and its important and thought-provoking themes. I give Passing an 8 out of 10. As always, I would love to hear your thoughts on this one. Now, this is a pretty deep film that I thought, but I want to know what you guys thought. Do you have any insight? Did you like it, or was this one just not even your thing? Either way, let me know below. I hope you all are doing well, and let me know if there are any films that come to your mind that you would like to see me take a look at next. I have a whole list of some of the recommendations that you've mentioned in the past. Don't think I forgot about you guys, because I haven't. Anyways, continue to take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.